far as what I can contribute to the ayahuasca discussion, most of the samples that Jonathan discussed this afternoon were actually collected by Cass and myself in '76, and then Dennis wrote that paper using those samples and some which he had obtained earlier that year. They almost all came from a single shaman, Don Fidel Mozambique, who lived then at Yorinacocha near Pucallpa. We bioassayed all those brews, and they were very strong. When I began making my own ayahuasca, I used those experiences as the benchmark for what I was trying to achieve with my own brews. In terms of recipes, if you want to, rather than try and substitute an analog, if you're still interested in what goes into a healthy dose of ayahuasca, what I settled with, I had a clone, a single individual plant called Plowman 6041 that Tim Plowman had collected in Yurimaguas in 1970 that was called a Cielo Ayahuasca. The ayahuasqueros recognized types of ayahuasca more differentiated than the species. They speak of Cielo Ayahuasca, Trompetero Ayahuasca, so forth and so on. So this was a Cielo Ayahuasca, Plowman 6041. I grew it for many years, and when I made ayahuasca, I used 500 grams of fresh material per dose and 85 grams of fresh Psychotria viridis per dose, and then prepared it in the standard way, which is to boil the total volume of crushed ayahuasca and Psychotria viridis. You make it in a non-aluminum pot. You don't use aluminum utensils because the aluminum is reactive and will mess with the effectiveness of the ayahuasca. And you layer in to the pot, these pots can be quite large, layer in Psychotria leaves, crushed Banisteriopsis coffee, the entire plant vigorously smashed with a hardwood club to separate the fibrous material, and then you boil it for 4 hours at a rolling boil, not an explosive boil, but a constant boil. Pour off the deeply yellow liquid that results. Carmine is yellow, and you pour off the mother liquor into another container, replace the first wash with a second wash, boil it 4 hours more, then discard all the solid material, heave it steaming into the bushes, and then combine the 2 washes, which is a lot of water, 10, 15 gallons of water, and then and then drive it down to the number of doses that you have pre-calculated. I can make up to 12 to 15 doses at a time in pots of this size, and I drive it down to 100 milliliters per dose. In the final evaporation, you want to be careful not to boil it too rapidly, or the sugars which are cooked out of the ayahuasca will tend to caramelize and make it thick. This does not affect the pharmacology of the ayahuasca. It makes it hell to swallow. And if you do it right, you can get it down to 100 milliliters and it will still pour it's as thin as water. It won't thicken unless you have boiled it with too hot a flame.
You're not destroying any psychoactive utensils? The more caramelized one and the more liquid one?
No, it's more like it's an aesthetic thing. It shows that you hurried it and if you're giving it to people who are knowledgeable, they will comment on this. The sign of amateurish ayahuasca is ayahuasca that's thick, because it needn't be. Those are just sugars. It's not doing any good. My interest in ayahuasca, which I indulged over 25 years or so, began with, and if you haven't read it, you should probably read Burroughs and Ginsberg's book, The Yahé Letters. The Search for the Blue Flash is how I think of it. And it sort of initiates the modern era of writing about ayahuasca. The most recent interesting book about ayahuasca, other than Eduardo's commentaries on the paintings of Pablo Amaringo, is probably Michael Taustig's book, Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man, which is just a wonderful book. Even if you don't give a hoot about drugs, I think it's a wonderful book for the richness of the language and the way in which he tells the story of the 20th century history of shamanism in the Putumayo region. But my interest in ayahuasca was the same interest that many of the early ethnographers and anthropologists were motivated by, which was persistent rumors of group states of mind. So, as Jonathan mentioned, the first people to characterize the alkaloid named it telepathine. This was because they had the grandiose hope that this would be a telepathic drug. And in a sense, I think it's too early to dismiss this possibility. Most of us think of telepathy as one person hearing another person think. That I don't think ayahuasca can deliver. But what it can deliver is an incredible ability to see what other people mean. Ayahuasca is driven by sound, by song, by whistling, and its ability to transform sound, including vocal sound, into the visual spectrum indicates that some kind of information processing membrane or boundary is being overcome by the pharmacology of this stuff. And things normally experienced as acoustic experience become instead visibly beheld. And it's quite spectacular. I mean, I've had ayahuasca where, you can sing a tone and just lay down like a Barnett Newman painting, a chartreuse line 1.5 inches wide in the darkness, and then you switch the tone and cross it at a 90-degree angle, and then as you begin to experiment, you discover that the whole modality of behind your closed eyes is open to being driven by these sounds. And I think probably a lot of the shamanism, especially the main rivers shamanism involving ayahuasca, is this kind of pseudo-telepathic involvement with sound. There are a lot of interesting things about ayahuasca, even in distinction or in contrast with other psychoactive plants. For example, it's essentially brain soup. There's nothing in it which doesn't occur naturally in human neural metabolism. When you take ayahuasca, you alter the ratios tremendously and the concentrations. But, mescaline, so far as we know, salvia divinorum, ibogaine, these things don't occur ordinarily in human metabolism. Mescaline might under certain conditions. But the major psychedelic neurotransmitters are what are represented in ayahuasca.